30 years after Columbus discovered America, Spanish soldiers of fortune scoured the New World looking for gold. Francisco Pizarro thought that he had found the ultimate prize. Risking everything, he led his small band of men deep into the heart of South America to confront one of the greatest civilizations on Earth, the Inca. In their quest to conquer or die, they changed the destiny of the Americas. They were known as the Konquistadors.
Svaki početak je težak, ali uz porodicu i pravu podršku, poslije mnogo truda, do prave poslovnosti, pouzdanost i povjerenje. Nova banka.
In 1527, off the Pacific coast of South America, a Spanish ship intercepts a native raft laden with fine textiles, silver, and gold. This chance encounter proves the leader of the expedition, Francisco Pizarro, right, and confirms rumors of a rich empire somewhere in the unexplored heart of South America. An empire the Spaniards believe must contain a mythical city of gold, an El Dorado. Six years earlier, Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in the name of God in Spain, starting a gold rush to the New World. Now every conquistador dreams of finding another empire of gold. The source of the treasure found on the raft was a land called Peru. After 25 years in the New World, Pizarro felt he was on the brink of discovering this fabled land of gold.
Here it was exactly what the Spaniards were looking for. And from then on, Pizarro is convinced that, and their further voyages down the coast convinced them that here is a new realm of gold, which is just there for the taking.
From his base in Panama, Pizarro and his partner Diego de Almagro start to hatch a plan. They're determined to conquer Peru before anyone else. But first they need two things: a license from the King of Spain and money to bankroll their expedition.
These adventures were commercial operations. This was a major gamble.
So in 1528, Pizarro set sail for Spain and the royal court. A journey which took him nearly 4 months. Spain was emerging as a rich and powerful empire. It had conquered lands in Europe and the Americas. Pizarro had served in many of these campaigns. On his return to Spain, Pizarro immediately started lobbying for a royal license. He played up his military experience.
He was an outstanding soldier, tough, brave, always ready and eager for war. In times of war, Pizarro felt good and happy. In times of peace, he was restless and bored.
But Pizarro knew he had problems. He had no connections at court. He was illiterate. He needed a specially made stencil just to sign his name. But what worried him most was a dark secret from his past. Born in 1478, poor and illegitimate, in Extremadura, in rural Spain, at age 14, Pizarro joined the army, where gambling and a hot temper nearly finished his career.
He killed another soldier with a knife in a quarrel over a game of cards. This forced Pizarro to spend 3 years as a fugitive, hidden away, up until the year 1502, when he sneaks aboard a ship in Europe, which sails for the Americas.
Now at age 50, Pizarro was back in Spain and gambling again, this time for the greatest prize of all. Yet he still knew nothing of the mysterious empire he dreamed of conquering. He had no idea of the size of the challenge before him. The Inca Empire stretched 3,000 miles down the length of the Andes and covered some of the world's highest, most rugged terrain. It was the greatest empire in the Americas, far more powerful than any civilization yet encountered by the Conquistadors. In less than 100 years, led by a series of visionary leaders culminating in the rule of Huayna Capac, Inca armies had conquered half of South America, absorbing 20 million people into their empire.
The Inca Empire, like any empire, ruled over a very diverse population. As the Incas expanded, they conquered various other groups, some of almost equal political complexity. Some of these subjects were subjugated willingly and participated fully within the Inca Empire, while others were conquered and continuously rebelled.
With well over 100,000 soldiers armed with deadly weapons, they overwhelmed their enemies.
The Inca soldiers' preferred weapon was usually this kind of mace. The Inca would use these weapons to considerable effect to just literally slaughter an enemy. These were the real head bashers of the indigenous people of the New World.
Had Pizarro known of the size of the Inca armies, he might have thought twice. The great Inca armies were deployed using a network of over 14,000 miles of roads. With fortified cities in every corner of the empire and a vibrant economy based on agriculture, Inca society flourished.
The Incas were great believers in order and are great believers that a ruler's position is only legitimate when a ruler takes care of his subjects. One of the titles of the Inca emperor was he who looks after the poor. The Incas derived prestige from making sure there were no famines and no dire poverty in their empire.
In the Inca religion, based on sun worship, Pizarro would confront a force as strong as Christianity.
The Incas drew a great deal of their power from religion. The Incas were able to use religion as a great force, and it became a tool in imperial conquest as well as in consolidation of the people that they conquered.
Religion and architecture merged in their temples and cities.
The Incas built many of these provincial centers to rule over the various ethnic groups that they had conquered, as any great empire would.
The rich Inca economy operated without money or writing. They communicated by a system of knotted cords called quipus, carried by swift messengers who linked every region to the imperial capital, Cuzco. When Pizarro encountered the gold-laden raft, the Inca messengers were relaying tragic news. The Emperor Huayna Capac was dead.
Indian societies planned everything out, generations in advance. So when Huayna Capac dies mysteriously from disease, it causes a lot of tremors throughout the Inca Empire that allow all kinds of machinery to break down. And the fact of the matter is that disease played a very important role in the political situations that the Spaniards are later able to exploit.
Two rivals were laying claim to the Inca throne. A power struggle just waiting for a conquistador. Luckily for Pizarro, he returned to Spain just as the extraordinary Aztec treasure from Mexico was causing a sensation. Impressed by Pizarro's military record and eager to enlarge his empire, the king approved Pizarro's plan to conquer Peru. His gamble had paid off. Pizarro went back to Panama to plan his expedition with his partner Almagro, but trouble was brewing. The crown had given Pizarro the governorship of all of Peru. Almagro was left with an insulting lesser governorship. When Almagro learned of Pizarro's apparent double-dealing, he threatened to abandon the whole enterprise. This wasn't the first patch of trouble between the two partners. They had been on two previous expeditions together. The first had been a disaster. They didn't find any gold, and many men died. They discovered the raft of gold on their second expedition. But Almagro had lost an eye to hostile natives, and blaming Pizarro, he strongly pushed to withdraw to Panama. But Pizarro refused. He desperately wanted to find the source of the gold. A violent quarrel erupted. From that moment on, bad blood ran between the two partners. Almagro returned to Panama, bitter and angry. Pizarro stayed, but he sensed the remainder of his men were on the brink of mutiny. So he raised the stakes and declared that all those wanting glory would be generously rewarded. The rest could return to Panama. Then he carved a line in the sand. Only 13 men, known as the 13 of Glory, crossed Pizarro's line. But Pizarro soon ran out of resources and was forced to return to Panama. And now, having got his royal license and title, Pizarro risked losing his partner Almagro's invaluable help. He would be unable to achieve his dreams alone. They drafted a new contract, giving Almagro a bigger share and the title of governor of all lands conquered beyond those of Pizarro. But Almagro now distrusted Pizarro, a rift that would one day cost them both their lives. Pizarro sailed from Panama on December 27, 1530. Almagro remained behind to recruit more men to join the expedition later. After scouring the inhospitable coast, they finally arrive at the Inca port of Tumbes in April 1532. There, Pizarro finds terrible signs of war. But there was a greater catastrophe. A deadly disease brought from Europe has swept across the continent from Mexico. The countryside lies in ruins. Within months, half of the Inca Empire's population of 20 million people is dead.
Smallpox spread faster than the conquistadors themselves. A wave of smallpox killed millions of indigenous inhabitants, and one of those was the ruling emperor, Huayna Capac.
His death has left a dangerous power vacuum. Huayna Capac's son, Huáscar, was viewed as the legitimate heir by the lords of Cusco, the imperial capital in the south. But in the north, his half-brother, Atahualpa, also claimed the throne. The situation plunged the empire into civil war.
The Spaniards were really very adept at looking for strategic weaknesses in the political structures of Indian kingdoms. I think it's possible that Pizarro may have been timing his moves to actually make his approach on the Inca realms based on advanced information he may have had.
Pizarro now waits to see the result of the Inca conflict. In a series of crushing victories, Atahualpa's battle-hardened forces defeat Huáscar and capture him. Seizing his opportunity, Pizarro resolves to meet Atahualpa, the winner of the Civil War. In mid-September 1532, he leaves a garrison on the coast. Then, with only 62 horsemen and 106 foot soldiers, Pizarro begins his march into the largest empire in the Americas. Climbing high into the Andes Mountains, Francisco Pizarro and his band of only 168 men march into the fractured and war-torn Inca Empire with a license of conquest from their king. Hundreds of miles to the south, reports of strangers raping and pillaging their way through a remote corner of the empire reach Atahualpa as he prepares for his victory celebrations.
The ruling emperor was a man that people were unable to talk directly to. They couldn't even look at him. Anything that Atahualpa touched was saved in special containers. He was a god on earth and had to be treated separately from all those that he came in contact with.
Atahualpa's new status made him feel totally invincible.
The Incas were a very organized military power. There'd just been a civil war, but before that, they had pretty much conquered the known world in the past century. They could have dealt with Pizarro quite easily if they had made a determined effort to do so.
Atahualpa is outraged by the Spaniards' violent behavior, but instead of sending his soldiers to crush them, he sends envoys to observe them.
These spies that he'd sent had come back and told him, these guys are lazy, bearded robbers and pirates. They ride around on big llamas. They're always squabbling among themselves. They don't seem to have a big lord among them. They don't have the kind of self-restraint that the Incas esteemed highly. So they saw the Spaniards as a filthy rabble. He didn't realize that they were a serious threat.
Nearly 2 months after leaving his garrison in San Miguel, Pizarro approaches Cajamarca, a town high in the Andes. He sends Atahualpa a request for a meeting. In soaring mountain passes at over 13,000 feet, Pizarro and his men encounter divisions of the Royal Inca Army. The Incas ignore the Spaniards. Pizarro wonders if he's marching into a trap. Then his scouting party brings him more alarming news. 80,000 of Atahualpa's troops are camped in the valley below Cajamarca. In a desperate position, Pizarro realizes he needs to take the initiative. His only hope to avoid being attacked is to send a delegation of his most trusted men to meet Atahualpa and tell him Pizarro has come in peace. This was to be the first formal meeting between these two alien worlds. Spanish chronicles recorded the event.
Hernando de Soto arrived above him with his horse, but Atahualpa remained still, making no movement. Soto came so close that the horse's nostrils stirred the emperor's crown, but Atahualpa never moved.
The Incas had never seen horses before, and many were very afraid. But Atahualpa was unimpressed.
Atahualpa was looking at this rather chaotic, quarrelsome bunch of European desperados who never take a bath, who are always pulling their swords and knives out at each other over games of cards, and who are always stealing things. And so he cannot take them seriously.
Then Captain de Soto offered Atahualpa a token of friendship. Atahualpa's general took the ring. The tension eased. The Inca then offered the traditional cup of chicha, a beer made from corn. Fearing it was poisoned, de Soto drank nervously. Atahualpa's general told them to occupy 3 houses in the main square of Cajamarca. The next day, Atahualpa would come to visit Pizarro.
There had been this encounter between the two of great symbolic importance in explaining the mutual suspicion and the incompatibility of these two civilizations.
When de Soto returned to camp that night, Spanish chroniclers recorded,
The campfires of the Inca army could be seen. It looked like a brilliantly star-studded sky. All were full of fear, for we were so few and so deep in the land.
As morning broke, the Inca troops began to move. Although his only possible reinforcements under Diego de Almagro were thousands of miles behind him, Pizarro was plotting one of the boldest gambles in military history.
Francisco Pizarro's plan is to take Atahualpa by surprise. He doesn't know exactly how he's going to do this, but he wants to take him prisoner, because then Pizarro has Atahualpa captive and hostage. Atahualpa alive is valuable. Atahualpa dead is worthless.
Hidden away in the corridors and passageways behind the square, the Spaniards spent a restless night in a state of high anxiety. Suspecting nothing, the Inca nobles put on their ceremonial gold and silver and advance on the town, unarmed. Leaving late in the day, Atahualpa makes the 168 Spaniards wait in Cajamarca for his arrival from his camp a few miles away. As the afternoon wears on, the Spaniards become more and more terrified the Inca are planning an attack. Pizarro reassures his men, urging them to muster all their courage.
All the Spaniards, even Pizarro, are so afraid. It's a kind of fear that leaves them in a cold sweat. They realize that the situation is desperate. But on the following day, they had no choice but to go out and fight, in spite of their fear, because in the end, it was all about survival. Living or dying.
By late afternoon, Atahualpa and his entourage of 10,000 men finally approach Cajamarca to confront Pizarro.
Atahualpa thought he was carrying out an impressive piece of political theater, hoping to use the Spaniards to enhance his victory celebrations. Outraged by the reports of their behavior that he's received, he also wants to punish them. He was going to castrate the Spanish men and make them into eunuchs to look after his royal harem. And he was going to breed the horses.
As the sun starts to set, Atahualpa and his procession enter the town square. It is empty. When he sees no Spaniards in Cajamarca, Atahualpa assumes they've run for their lives. A Spanish friar named Vicente de Valverde comes out to greet the emperor. Atahualpa demands that all the gold the Spaniards have stolen be returned immediately. Again, a ceremonial cup of chicha is offered. Valverde casts it aside. Valverde then demands Inca submission to the Spanish king and their conversion to Christianity. The Bible is the first book Atahualpa has ever seen. He is mystified by the strange object which puts words in the mouth of the priest. Just as Valverde rejects Atahualpa's hospitality, Atahualpa rejects Valverde's God. Outraged by this sacrilege, the friar shouts to Pizarro, "Did you not see what happened? March out against him, for I absolve you!" In 2 hours, the fate of a continent will be changed forever. Cutting down the unarmed Inca, the Spaniards hack their way towards the emperor. In the heat of battle, one of Pizarro's men moves to kill the emperor, but Pizarro takes Atahualpa alive. For the first time, Pizarro and Atahualpa come face to face. Pizarro and his men have committed one of the most brutal massacres in military history. 8,000 unarmed Inca lie dead. Each Spaniard has killed an average of 48 Incas. On November 16th, 1532, 168 men brought the largest empire in the Americas to its knees. The great Inca emperor, Atahualpa, is now the prisoner of an illiterate Spanish soldier of fortune.
The kidnapping was very precisely worked out, and the timings, it seems now, were quite brilliant. So the shock effect in the end was devastating.
Pizarro assures Atahualpa no harm will come to him. But it's Pizarro's life that's in grave danger. What will happen when news of the massacre reaches the rest of Atahualpa's army of 80,000 men waiting in the valley below? As night falls, the Konquistadors fear for their lives.
Vrijeme je novac. Pametno trošite vrijeme. Elektronsko bankarstvo. Nova banka.
Francisco Pizarro now finds himself in a trap of his own creation. But salvation comes from his captive, the Emperor Atahualpa.
Atahualpa will not order his army to attack because the first guy to be killed will be him, obviously. And at the same time, the Spaniards are going to keep Atahualpa alive. So you've got sort of two circles. You've got an outer circle of an Inca army surrounding a much smaller Spanish army. And then in the very middle is Atahualpa being held there, unable and unwilling to command his army to attack. And Pizarro not really knowing what to do next.
The captive emperor makes the first move.
Atahualpa must be in an absolutely shattered state of mind. And within a few days, he's learning bits of Spanish and he's making sarcastic remarks to the Spaniards. He's obviously an extremely tough and resilient man, a true king and emperor born. But he's thinking, how can I get out of here? And he quickly realizes the thing the Spaniards want more than anything else is gold and silver.
So Atahualpa makes Pizarro an offer the Spaniards can't refuse. Atahualpa promises to fill a room 8 feet high, 17 feet wide, and 22 feet long with gold, and 2 other rooms with silver, in exchange for his freedom. Pizarro thinks Atahualpa is bluffing. The offer sounds too good to be true. But with nothing to lose, Pizarro accepts. Although a hostage, Atahualpa is still the emperor, and his ransom orders are swiftly obeyed. From his jail, he secretly dispatches other, very different orders. He sends word to his generals that his army must be ready to attack on his command.
He was presumably trying to get his armies moved around, partly to forestall any attacks by his brother's forces, but also to prepare for the extermination of the Spaniards.
While both sides wait for the gold to arrive, an uneasy truce descends. Atahualpa's huge army is on standby in the valley. Weeks pass. Pizarro teaches Atahualpa to play chess, and the Inca ruler learns more Spanish. Pizarro doesn't know if he's risking his whole expedition by waiting.
I think Atahualpa thought that giving them the gold was his only hope. I think Atahualpa was probably intelligent enough to realize that that probably wouldn't do it in the end. But certainly it would buy him time. And I think what he was trying to do in those early days was to buy as much time as he could. And he did buy time. He bought enough time to get rid of his brother, his rival claimant for the Inca throne.
Atahualpa fears his rival claimant for the throne, Huáscar, whom he defeated and captured, might now order his army to attack Atahualpa, or even side with the Spaniards. So Atahualpa orders Huáscar's execution. Finally, gold and silver begin pouring in from all corners of the empire. Amazed by the sheer quantity, the Spaniards react with shock, and then delight. Trying to keep track of the overwhelming volume, they make a record of every single piece before putting it in the room.
So everyone was very surprised, but the gold just keeps on arriving, and the room is filling up. While Atahualpa wants to stack the containers this way up, the Spaniards want to put them this way up, so that more gold will fit in the room. And so there's an argument. Also, a lot of gold starts disappearing, because at night, the Spaniards who are on guard steal it, so the room does not fill up at the expected rate.
Since the gold still hasn't filled the room, Pizarro sends 3 men south to the Inca capital, Cuzco, where Atahualpa has told him there is more than enough treasure to complete the ransom. Astonished by what they find in Cuzco, the Spaniards pillage the golden icons at the Temple of the Sun. The Incas are shocked at such violent sacrilege. Then, in April 1533, just as more treasure was on its way, Pizarro's partner, Diego de Almagro, arrives in Cajamarca with 150 reinforcements. For Pizarro and his men, they are a mixed blessing. While he was still in Panama, Almagro had hanged his own secretary for spreading lies that he was plotting to kill Pizarro. But Pizarro was only slightly reassured. Behind a facade of goodwill, the two partners distrust each other. Pizarro's men are even more suspicious. These new arrivals will surely want a piece of the action. But for now, the Spaniards must put aside their differences in the face of a much greater threat. The 80,000 Inca soldiers still camped in the valley around Cajamarca. With the Spanish garrison doubling overnight, Atahualpa starts having serious doubts. He wonders if he'll ever get out of Cajamarca alive, and whether he should now give the order to attack. Over the next few months, huge pack trains of hundreds of llamas carrying the rest of the emperor's ransom in gold and silver arrive from all corners of the empire. A fortune guaranteed to bring out the worst in men. Driven by gold fever, the conquistadors are on the verge of spilling blood. Almagro's men are jealous.
So a strong rivalry develops between Almagro's men and Pizarro's men, because Almagro's men cannot get any of Atahualpa's ransom. Only Pizarro's soldiers are entitled to receiving it, because they're the ones who risked their lives to capture Atahualpa.
Almagro strongly objects to his men being cheated. Grudgingly, Pizarro and Almagro reach an agreement to share the gold. More than 30 tons of priceless and sacred Inca artifacts are collected and greedily melted down into gold and silver bars. Each horseman was to receive 270 pounds of gold and silver. Foot soldiers, half this amount, but enough to make them richer than they'd ever imagined. Pizarro's share is 630 pounds of gold, twice as much silver, and Atahualpa's solid gold chair. Then, Pizarro hears unsettling reports that Atahualpa is secretly amassing even more troops in the valley around Cajamarca. Atahualpa dismisses the rumors as a plot by one of his rivals. He implores Pizarro to keep his word and release him. Instead, Pizarro sends a scouting party under one of his trusted captains, Hernan de Soto, to investigate. A growing number of Spaniards want Atahualpa dead. Others say that killing the emperor would be suicide. They are outnumbered by the Inca army 250 to 1. Pizarro must do the impossible, keep the Spanish united, and keep Atahualpa thinking he will honor their agreement.
But ultimately, the force of the majority prevails. The Spaniards are afraid that Atahualpa is betraying them and wants to kill them, because they believe that his armies no longer obey him and that even against Atahualpa's orders, they are approaching Cajamarca against the Spanish.
Since Atahualpa is Pizarro's only life insurance, he is opposed to killing him, but he also cannot release him.
They simply couldn't let him go. As soon as they let him go, the Inca Empire would have their ruler once again, and the Inca armies would come crashing down on the few Spaniards who were in the center of Cajamarca.
To appease his men and to buy time until he finds a better solution to the growing crisis, Pizarro brings conspiracy charges against Atahualpa. Since the only testimony permitted comes from subjects disloyal to the Inca emperor, the priest Vicente de Valverde, acting as judge, finds Atahualpa guilty. He sentences him to death by fire.
I think he probably realized right away that that trial was a sham. I mean, he knew that there were various factions among the Spaniards and that one group of Spaniards had been wanting to kill him for months.
Atahualpa begs Pizarro to wait until De Soto returns and proves his innocence. But Pizarro is powerless against the court's judgment.
It became plain perhaps that without Atahualpa he could even more easily manipulate an unstable situation within the empire. He could play off internally the factions within the Incas themselves more easily without Atahualpa around. So I think he became surplus to immediate requirements, and they decided to kill him.
Death by fire is a horrible sacrilege to the Inca. Atahualpa pleads for another way to die. But only if Atahualpa is christened will Pizarro be willing to spare him death by fire.
The prospect of having his body burned appalled Atahualpa, not just because of the painful manner of being burned at the stake, but also because if his body was burned, he would never have a mummy, and therefore he would never be able to continue this busy afterlife that former Inca emperors always had. So the Spaniards do him the great favor of garroting him instead. There is a tradition that Pizarro cheated him even in death by burning his body later on.
On Saturday, the 26th of July, 1533, Atahualpa is executed in the square at Cajamarca. A brutal event that changes the Inca Empire forever. It leaves Pizarro with no cards to play, and an 80,000-strong Inca army surrounding him. When news of Atahualpa's death spreads across the empire, his allies in the north mourn, while his enemies in the south celebrate.
When you have an empire that starts to crumble, as soon as the great central authority starts to weaken, all sorts of dissident groups, very often ethnic groups, start to reassert their own national rights.
Once again, the breakdown of the Inca Empire plays right into Pizarro's hands. Leaders from the south, hoping to regain control of the whole empire, pledge their support for Pizarro. He crowns Tupac Hualpa, a puppet ruler to pacify the Incas. Pizarro then sets off 750 miles south to secure the one thing he still needs to consolidate his conquest, the imperial capital, Cusco. First, he must cross hostile territory, still controlled by angry supporters of Atahualpa. A few days into their march, they are attacked. But as they near Cusco along the royal Inca roads, Pizarro and his 300 men are welcomed as liberators.
On their way, they begin to meet ethnic groups that had recently been conquered by the Incas and are anxious to free themselves. So from this point on, it is no longer simply an issue of Spaniards against the Inca Empire, but it becomes Spaniards and their indigenous allies against a quickly crumbling Inca heartland.
Before they reach Cusco, Pizarro faces yet another crisis. The newly crowned Tupac has been poisoned. Desperate and vulnerable, Pizarro needs to fill another power vacuum. A minor Inca prince with a distant claim to the throne presents himself to Pizarro. Manco Inca is also from the south. Only 18 years old, he has spent the last 5 years of his life on the run from Atahualpa's army. To Pizarro, Manco seems compliant enough to make the perfect puppet ruler. Pizarro tells Manco, "You must understand that I have come to free you from slavery and to liberate the people of Cusco from tyranny."
Manco and the Cusco faction of the Incas think that they can use the Spaniards to mop up Atahualpa's forces, while the Spaniards are thinking, hey, now we've got a puppet Inca who is respected in the capital. We can use him to take over this country. So each side is playing this game where they're pretending that they're in an alliance when really each side is jockeying for domination.
On November 15th, 1533, Pizarro and Almagro enter the Inca capital with their 300 men unopposed. Dazzled by Cusco, they write to King Charles V,
The city is the greatest ever seen in this country or anywhere in the Indies. We can assure your majesty that it is so beautiful it would be remarkable even in Spain.
It was about the size of Paris or London in 1500, but very much a royal city. Cusco meant the navel of the earth. It was the place at which heaven nourished the body of the earth. And the Inca was the conduit through which this heavenly power passed it.
A month after his arrival, Pizarro engineers the crowning of Manco, making him the Inca emperor. A maneuver Pizarro will later regret. With their puppet ruler in place, the Spaniards go on the rampage, raping and stealing almost as much gold and silver as they had collected at Cajamarca. Then they torture the Inca to reveal where they can find even more gold. The Spaniards exert their rule with utter depravity. News of it even reaches the Spanish court. Francisco Pizarro's brother returns to Spain, bringing the king's share of their enormous haul of gold and silver. The king is awestruck by Pizarro's success, but he is also deeply disturbed by his means of achieving it. The very man the king had appointed to represent Spain has killed a fellow monarch. The royal court orders Pizarro to treat all Indian rulers with respect. The king wrote, "We have been displeased by the death of Atahualpa since he was a monarch, and particularly as it was done in the name of justice and the king." But the king's wishes are ignored. As news spreads throughout Spain of the unbelievable riches to be found in Peru, it causes a gold rush.
Any old ship that can sail is coming to the coast of Peru, and all these bandits are swarming into the country on anything that would float. The Spaniards hadn't really finished off the Incas. It was a very complex, chaotic situation that raged in Peru. It is the beginning of a 40-year power struggle between Spaniards and Incas. At the same time, during that 40 years, you've got the indigenous people dying like flies from these new diseases, so that the population is collapsing at a rate that we can scarcely imagine today. This is what makes the Spanish conquest not only feasible in the first place by creating the Civil War, but also sustainable.
With his fortune made, the 56-year-old Francisco Pizarro continues to build new Spanish cities throughout the former Inca Empire. Finally, completing his conquest, he builds a new Spanish capital, the port of Lima.
If today the map of South America has a specific shape, this is thanks to two people, the Incas, who were the great conquerors of the whole territory, and Francisco Pizarro, who conquered them, but knew how to maintain what he'd conquered. So Peru's borders are how they are, thanks to Francisco Pizarro.
Since coming across the raft of gold 7 years before, Pizarro had found his El Dorado. He had done the impossible, overthrowing an empire of millions with only 300 men. The man who'd come from nothing had become one of the richest and most infamous men in history.
He didn't go back to Spain. He was keen to carve out his own individual kingdom in Peru. He's a very cold, calculating, utterly ruthless individual. As a conquistador, he seems to be the purest of the lot in his simple concern with power and wealth.
Pizarro had taken the ultimate gamble, and he'd won the greatest prize in the Americas. But now, the man Pizarro thought was the perfect puppet ruler would threaten to destroy everything he'd gained.
Sigurno dobar izbor je staro vino, stara ljubav, stari prijatelji na koje se uvijek možemo osloniti i naravno nova banka, banka za novi poslovni svijet.